So, hello again. Welcome to this Cambridge University Land Society webinar. I'm delighted to welcome you. My name is Manish Datta. I'm an incoming committee member of Cambridge University Land Society and soon to be chair of the Society's ESG and Sustainability Forum, who are hosting this webinar. I'm a fellow at the University of Cambridge, a director of sustainability at Specsavers and advisor to BNP Paribas Real Estate Investment Management. Now, for those that don't know us, Cambridge University Land Society, or CULS, was formed over 50 years ago, aiming to link members of CULS within and outside the Departments of Land Economy and Department of Architecture at the university, and to provide opportunities for the exchange of views upon which this topics of interest. And we have almost 1,000 members, all alumni of the university, who bring together a diversity of experience and interests. And each year we hold, as a society, a number of events, many of them organized by the forums that form the society. And the ESG and Sustainability Forum has had great discussions around topics such as biodiversity, net gain, health and well-being, adaptation, battery storage, rural land, designing buildings to green standards that avoid greenwashing. So you can see that we don't hesitate to discuss the hardest and most complex topics. And this morning is no different. We are discussing the influence of brown discount and/or green premia in determining the quality, value, and performance of commercial and residential real assets. And to help us with this discussion, I'm really delighted to welcome an outstanding, distinguished, and hand-picked panel who will shortly introduce themselves and provide an introductory remark. But to really help us through this conversation, I'm extending a very warm welcome to the moderator for this discussion, Will Robson, who is the Executive Director and Global Head of Real Estate Solutions and Research at the MSCI. Will, welcome. I hand over the baton to you.
Thanks very much, Manish. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the introduction. So as Manish said, I head up real assets research and solutions research at MSCI. MSCI is a provider of data and tools to the investment community across all asset classes, but I focus on real assets. We help people understand the financial performance of their portfolios, markets, capital trends, risk across the piece, and put that in the context of in a multi-asset context. And so we're helping clients do all sorts of things, from sovereign wealth funds allocating real estate, understanding where they should be in allocation, and right down to smaller scale Southeast industrial brokers understanding comp sets for the latest sale. So the interest I have in climate is we have a large ESG and climate business as well as MSCI, and have developed some tools for real assets investors to understand the climate value at risk of their portfolios, and increasingly trying to do research to understand how those climate characteristics and risks facing buildings impact financially on the performance of the buildings and the pricing, and continue to help clients to understand those risks. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, say a line about who they are and where they're from, their interest in this topic, and some introductory comments. So we'll start with Franz first. Franz, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks. Well, name's Franz Fuerst. I'm a professor of real estate and urban economics here at the Land Economy Department at Cambridge.
Thanks, Franz. And do you have a couple of introductory thoughts of main points that you'd like people to take away from this webinar today?
Yeah, sure. So I think when we discuss green premiums and brown discounts, it warrants taking a broader look. And we cannot ignore that the broader picture is really one of an increasing polarization of ESG and green investments, both by political attitude, geographical markets, quality segments, and so forth. And that ESG is really in the midst of a gigantic backlash in certain quarters, particularly in the US, as it has become highly politicized, embroiled in a sort of cultural war, while at the same time we see a massive increase in ESG and investment in sustainability and green. You will probably all be aware that some states in the US have even passed legislation that makes it a crime to actually consider ESG criteria. So, of course, this is nothing new. We have always seen criticism and pushback, and to a certain extent, that's healthy. I remember when I published my first study, co-authored with Pat McAllister back in 2011, that looked at the question of green premiums in US offices. And back then, we found a rental premium of about 3 to 5%, a sales premium of 13 to 60%. There were lots of questions from academics and practitioners alike. Some have questioned the methodology, and no methodology is ever perfect, so those are legitimate questions. Other practitioners have just told us back then, there is no green premium. I just don't see it in the market. And we said, well, we have hundreds of thousands of observations and empirical evidence against it. And I think now the debate has really moved on, and there is a broad consensus that there is such a thing as green premiums and brown discounts. Of course, there's a huge range of those, and we need to examine each and every one of those, but we have a really solid evidence base of hundreds of studies now. The only thing that I would say, and hopefully we can get into in the discussion, is that we need to broaden the discussion, not just look at energy efficiency, but also in terms of energy sufficiency. So if we're purely focusing on the technology and doing things more efficiently, I think that falls short of the general question of carbon footprints. And then finally, I think that also feeds into a debate of life cycle costs and embodied carbon, which I think is still not really captured sufficiently in measures that, well, mainly focus on operational carbon.
Okay.
So I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Franz. The next panelist I'd like to introduce is Lucy Greenwood. Lucy, would you like to just introduce yourself and the role and what you want to bring to the discussion today?
Absolutely. So I'm Lucy Greenwood. I'm a director in the residential research team at Savills. So I focus on the housing market and sort of all aspects of it, looking at kind of the values achieved when you're looking at kind of market, what the market's actually doing and all the dynamics there. And I think what's really interesting about this topic is that it gets asked about all the time, particularly in the new build sector, about kind of, is there a green premium? If you're going to invest more in a property to put those features in, will you get more back from it? And sort of just thinking kind of more broadly about that new build side, I think one of the key things is about how do we get the data. As Franz alluded to, it's hard to work out a good methodology and to be able to kind of take it apart from everything else and exclude other factors that affect value. What we have found when we've looked at new build and comparing sort of more eco-green homes with a traditional standard build, new build, where we've got some good examples where you've got a lot of stock of each type in an area. What we find is for normal sort of average sized houses, so average to 3 beds and that kind of range of houses, you don't see a premium. But for larger homes, you do. So that's what we found kind of when we've looked at small developments where you've got sort of niche developers doing a high quality product that's got a lot of eco features. So there is a premium at the top end, but it's in small patches here and there. I think what's really interesting is how that evolves and if there is anything that changes. And one of the key things that's quite interesting is Octopus doing things around zero bills, because actually, although people do sort of care about the environment and you do see it kind of rising up the agenda, actually, when it comes to putting money down to buy a home, the challenge is what are your other factors? And actually the affordability of housing is so tough that actually you just need an extra bedroom rather than wanting to potentially pay that money for a green premium, for sort of more green features, even if you'd like them. So I think that's the real challenge. How do we balance those things out? But when it comes down to actually your running costs of your home, if it's going to reduce your bills, and that's why I mentioned Octopus, because they're doing sort of zero bills product. And so that's a really interesting one, because then obviously you're then not having to spend that monthly outlay on your bills if it's basically covered because your home is so efficient, it's free to run in that sense. I think in terms of sort of other sectors, in terms of build to rent and in terms of affordable housing, there is a stronger drive towards more sustainable, higher standard homes, purely because of the longer term ownership of those properties by those investors, and therefore needing to future-proof and ensure they don't need to retrofit those properties and pay for it later. So you are seeing a higher demand for them to buy and ensure that their homes that they own are higher standard. So yeah, I think that'll cover the summary for now, and we can dig into more of it later. Thanks, Will.
Great, thanks, Lucy. Our next panelist is David Stevens. David, would you like to introduce yourself and give us an idea of what you'd like to bring to the debate today?
Yeah, good morning, Will, and firstly, thank you for inviting me to join today's discussion. David Stevens, I'm head of the real estate finance team for London in HSBC. I'm part of the sort of senior leadership group within the real estate finance business, lending to real estate investors and developers in the UK corporate real estate market. Personally, I think like all of the panelists that we've got on here, the topic of sustainability is, I feel very passionately about this. And I think, you know, clearly whilst there is risk in tackling transition in the real estate environment, I also think there's a lot of opportunity as well. So I try and come at this as glass half full rather than glass half empty, as it were. But this is a topic that is becoming of more increased interest in the lending market. I think specifically relating to today's topic on green premiums and brown discounts, I've kind of looked at this through the lens of the office market. I think in today's market, we are now really starting to see evidence of green premiums and brown discounts driving value. This is being seen in significant bifurcation in the market, where there continues to be strong occupied demand for best-in-class assets. However, the opposite is now starting to be seen in secondary offices and secondary locations, where I think it's more challenging for landlords to attract tenants, and liquidity for assets is thinner. I also think the business case for investment is challenging in the current environment when we take into account the backdrop of the structural change in the office market, with from an occupational perspective driven by hybrid working, the increased interest rate environment, and also the inflationary cost environment. So personally, I think the topic of green premiums and brown discounts is going to be here to stay for a while, although potentially I think there is an argument to say some of that green premium is actually linked to perhaps a scarcity of green buildings and green stock, and perhaps that's something we can come back and debate in due course.
Great, thanks, David. And our final panelist is Jay Drexler. Jay, would you like to do the same? Tell us who you are away from and what you bring into the debate today.
Sure, thank you, Will, and good morning. Jay Drexler, I lead the asset management of office and retail assets for Oxford Properties across Europe and the UK. Both, like many of the panelists, both personally and professionally passionate about today's topic. The stat that's always jumped out at me is that 40% of the global greenhouse gas emissions comes from the built environment, and clearly a good reason for the decarbonization and transition of that. So within that space, and as we talk a bit about what's more incentivizing around the green premiums or brown discount, for me, it's not a question of one or the other. I think it's just a matter of timing, in my opinion. The green premium exists only as long as demand is greater than supply and legislation is still accommodating. So while this is the case, you know, I'm long on the premium side of this conversation, and depending on the market, you've got government incentives, you've access to financing, outsized occupier demand, cap market demand, sort of all lining up in support of this position. And then on the supply side of the conversation, I think over time, as this catches up, or as legislation gets tighter, combination of the two, I think the green premium conversation goes away, frankly, and the brown discount side of the conversation becomes a bit more binary. A non-compliant building, you know, will either stack up as candidate for decarbonization or it won't and become obsolete. And I think that's a sort of it's more of a timing topic between the two rather than a either or. But look forward to the conversation and pass it back to you, Will.
Great, thanks, Jay. I mean, I didn't really say much about what I thought I would bring to the conversation today, but given our position, a lot of what we do is around data and looking at clients' portfolios, looking at the transaction data across the whole market. And so we're really interested in that link between the kind of climate risk characteristics and financial performance and pricing. I think one of the major issues that we see is anecdotally, there's a lot of support for green premium or brown discount. I think there's increasing amounts of data available, and so we can do lots of partial analysis in certain pockets of data where we've got good coverage, but we're not yet at the stage in the market where we've got broad coverage of consistent metrics around emissions intensity or EPCs or whatever the metric you might want to look at is, having that consistent coverage across the whole swathes of indexes or markets isn't quite there yet. So producing standardized analysis for whole markets is still a difficulty. And that's because the data acquisition for clients on their own portfolios is still challenging. So maybe we can get into that data issue that investors and owners feel at the moment. Where we do have the data, though, we've got interesting insights. We've shown in our pricing data for cities like London and Paris a significant green premium of the order of 25 to 35% in kind of Paris and London offices, and that's been growing from 0 to 10% back in 2018. Now that is kind of comparing green rated buildings versus non-green rated buildings, and there's some control for kind of the size and the age and the kind of sub-market of the properties, but there's lots of other things that drive the value of a building. And I think the real challenge is not in realizing that kind of best-in-class assets are performing very well compared to the kind of the rest. That's often the case, and is particularly the case at the moment. It's trying to tease out exactly how much of that is down to the green credentials and how much is down to the other good quality credentials. Because I think the challenge for decarbonisation of the whole office stock or the whole real estate stock isn't about just having more brand new perfectly green buildings. It's about bringing everything else up to standard, and in a lot of cases it won't be going from a brown building to a fully efficient building. It'll be kind of stages, and investors will need to understand if they take something that's very brown to sort of middling, it's helping with the decarbonisation problem in stages, but are they going to get a return on their investment? And that question can't be answered yet by just understanding like the best in class building is attracting a 25% premium. What about the building that's pretty good but not as bad as the rest? So I'll just leave that as a thought, and we'll get into the moderated discussion. We've already had some questions sent in advance, so thank you to those who sent those in. We're starting to get some questions into the Q&A. For anyone that hasn't realized, there's a Q&A function in the Zoom webinar, so feel free to kind of drop questions in there and I'll try and pepper them in as we go through the discussion. So as we get back into this, maybe everybody can come back on camera and we can have a broad discussion. So I'll come to Franz first. So we touched on the kind of the premium discounts. I mean, Franz, you said you'd done some studies in the past already, and hinted at the kind of size that you've seen in those studies. Do you think that size of premium or discounts that we see in the market are enough to kind of steer us towards rapid decarbonisation? Because that's really the point of all this, is that it's going to lead to different allocations of capital and help solve the problem. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my short answer would be generally no, they are not sufficient to get us where we need to get, which is net zero. Well, actually as soon as possible, but definitely by the time that we have legally binding commitments to. And the reason for that is, well, first of all, if you look at the costs of the emissions, the damage that is being done, and if we get to a position where the damage that is being done globally in terms of climate change is actually priced adequately, we had to revise that figure upwards many, many times. Just the other day, a new paper has come up from the US, from authors from Harvard and Yale, that have actually said the actual price of carbon should be at least 10 times higher, if not more, if you apply a more accurate calculation. So they're estimating it at $1,000 per ton of CO2. Now, if you translated that backwards into real estate and the lowest performing assets in terms of, let's say, G-rated EPCs, then that discount would need to be a lot higher, just, you know, compounding the annual social cost of carbon. So my quick answer to that would be the brown discounts would actually be a lot higher if we factored in that true cost of the carbon emissions. So, and I think that's going to be, discovered by prices more and more. So those brown discounts will become a lot higher. And there is also going to be regulation, but obviously we don't know what the regulations will be. There have been quite a few U-turns, but I think eventually that is where we're headed.
Thanks, Franz. David, maybe if I can come to you next and take the kind of lending view of the situation. So these green premium discounts, so the broader question of how this is impacting on transactional activity, but does it impact the lender's appetite to lend on properties, and how do you kind of factor that into a decision to lend on a property? Do you think the availability of capital from the debt side is going to have a kind of a significant impact on these premium discounts?
Yeah, let me take the first question, which was around sort of transactional activity. I think it is a factor that is sort of coming through in the transactional market now. I think if anyone is bringing an asset to market for sale, if you're not including some sort of sell side diligence around sustainability and around, you know, the potential capex, etc., that's going to be required on a building, that will just be factored in by the purchaser, and it will impact on value. So I definitely think you're now starting to see that come through in the market, and it is driving some of that transactional activity. I think from the lending side of things, look, this is something that we've had on our agenda for some time. We've been thinking about transition risk across our book. We've been engaging with clients. I think it's fair to say that you've got a very broad range within that. So we've got you right the way from the PLC market, very sophisticated clients that are focused on this. They have resources focused on sustainability, and they, that's been driven by their stakeholders right the way through to sort of smaller single asset investors. And those points of sophistication are, perhaps driving the levels of conversations that we're having and the level of understanding. I would say that we don't have a hard and fast sort of, if it's an EPC today, we won't lend on the building. But what we will say is we want to understand from the client what their transition plan is. Do they have a costed transition plan that has, key milestones that will get them from where they are today to ensure that you've got a compliant building with regulation? Sort of slight hesitancy in saying that because regulation is shifting. I think we know where the direction of travel is from a regulatory perspective. I think arguably EPC-B is priced into the market today, and people are targeting that. But I think there's a whole debate that could be going on with the panel around whether EPCs is the right measure to be looking at this from. However, it's the one with the regulatory teeth at the moment.
Right, interesting. And do you see that this discussion comes up just at kind of new lending for acquisitions or kind of refinancings, or are people coming to you with a transition plan and looking for extra capital to kind of finance that transition plan explicitly? Do you think that would become a sort of a kind of an avenue of business is just kind of trying to finance that transition at an asset level, and what are the challenges with it?
Yeah, I would say all of the above. So, I mean, almost a new building is the easiest one, because planning dictates that there's probably likely to be a need to meet a certain level of accreditation on a building when it's delivered to market. So that can be quite easy. We're having, as I alluded to earlier, discussions around our existing book and ensuring that clients are focused on this and they're thinking about how they achieve that transition. And certainly we've had discussions, particularly with some of the larger funds, etc., that are specifically raising capital to look to deploy on a brown to green transition. So I think each one of those is at different stages of the market, but we definitely see it come through in the lending market these days.
Thanks, David. Maybe Lucy, if I could come to you next. I know you focus on the residential market. I was interested in what you said about the example where you could see a premium on large kind of affluent homes and not so much on kind of more average type homes. And so maybe we could link that with the kind of challenges around kind of upgrading of kind of normal housing, because it's going to be the vast majority of the stock. And how do you incentivize that if that's where the problem is, but there doesn't seem to be that appetite?
Yeah, great question. I guess there's lots in there. I think just thinking about kind of those bigger properties achieving a premium, what we see is that it's sort of the affluent, eco-conscious that are able to do it. So people that have they're later in life, they have more equity to be able to choose to buy a home that has all these features, and they care about it and they want to do it. So they're the ones buying these bigger homes that are at a premium for that. And yes, they've got other features as well, but as part of that, they're very sustainable. And you do see kind of in the sort of custom build, self-build side of things, people do tend to build homes to higher standards and much more eco features as well. And that again tends to be that similar market, that people that can afford it and have got the equity to do it. But for the sort of the majority of the mainstream, it's not necessarily an option because they just simply need a home and an extra bedroom for their growing family or whatever it is. I think when we come to existing stock, it is a different, there's a different angle there. I think there is a lot of challenges of upgrading existing stock. And actually, there's also that variety that people like a period property. So actually, if you just look at A, B, C, D, E, F, G ratings, it's not necessarily that A and B rating homes have higher values. And actually, when you look at it, they tend to be, but actually that's because they're new builds as well, because it's typically the new build that are A and B rated. So you've got to distinguish between the two. But actually, some of the most beautiful properties are really low rated on an EPC scale, but actually people desire them for that purposes. I think what's been really interesting is seeing how, because of the cost of living increasing and energy costs and running costs of homes becoming much more to the fore, actually those pretty homes, the ones that people like because they're old and they look nice, actually if they then cost so much to run, then actually the practicalities of that mean that for some households that just simply doesn't work actually in reality, and they're then choosing to maybe move and make a different choice. Upgrading your property to be able to get it to a higher level is something that people are trying to do to some level. The challenge is the cost and how you balance that out. And yes, the government is trying to help with various grants, but it hasn't necessarily actually been the most helpful way of doing it. There's been so many hoops you have to jump through to get the green home grants to be able to put in new heat pumps and insulation or whatever it is, that it hasn't been taken up as much as the government pot is there to do. And actually we haven't seen the upgrade in existing stock to that level. So I think where we do see it more is the affordable side, because the affordable sector is regulated. They have to upgrade their stock to a higher level. The challenges they then face is they need a lot of money to put into their stock to be able to upgrade it. They also have the challenge that if for their really poor quality stock that is going to cost a lot to upgrade, or actually simply isn't going to be possible to upgrade it to the levels they need, what do they do with it? And that stock then arguably, do they sell it off and sort of then buy new stock in? But actually they still have that social purpose of like, well, actually that stock then is still in the wider residential market, someone else is then going to live in it, probably PRS, and actually socially, is that the right thing for them to do? So there's a lot of conundrums about what do we do with this older stock that needs upgrading, but is going to cost so much or simply isn't possible to do it. And actually, I guess the challenge really we have is, should we be actually demolishing and rebuilding things to a greater level? Because we haven't been doing that in the level that we used to. And actually homes are expected to last for a lot longer now, relative to what they were, just the way that we're delivering homes and regenerating areas. But arguably you ought to take some of that stock and just wholesale regenerate an area. Yes, you can reuse some of the materials, but obviously there's a carbon cost to that. But actually, simply, if those homes aren't good enough to live in and they're not worth anything because of it, then what do you do with that?
Yeah, okay. So a lot there in the answer as well. I think one thing I took from that is maybe some of the metrics that are used to describe the carbon inefficiency of a building just are a bit too abstract for people to really digest and factor into their decision making. So coming back to that octopus example, you sell a home as a zero bill home, then that's clear that what the saving is. And if you can translate these EPC ratings into likely bill costs and have that after the mortgage estimate, when you go on Rightmove or whatever, then that might help with influencing decisions.
Yeah, I think also it's sort of, when you come to buy a home, your mortgage, when you go to get your mortgage, it's not taking into consideration your bills at that point. If it did, and it could then mean that you get a better mortgage rate because of it, or you're able to afford a bit more because of it, then you could start to see people really incentivized to do it. At the moment, we're still very much in the infancy of doing that. And yes, there are some green mortgages where you can release some capital to upgrade your property to get to a high level. It's still a pretty small part of the market.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Lucy. Jay, if I can come to you now. So from an asset management perspective, it'd be interesting to understand how you see kind of these premium discounts impacting the leasing markets. But with a view to, like we talked about, there's an obvious kind of premium in kind of the best in class buildings, but across the kind of stock of an existing portfolio, a legacy portfolio, or the broader market, how do these things kind of enter into decisions around whether you can justify the investment to kind of upgrade properties into that sort of more middle market, assuming some of them you might be able to get right up to kind of best in class standard, but some might not get there, and it's kind of harder to make that decision potentially. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think from a portfolio standpoint, where we start, and I think it goes back to a little bit of what David was discussing around having a clear decarbonization plan with milestones. So we start, and we have a global portfolio, so it's not just unique to the UK, and we need a bit of a common language around a topic that can be a bit overwhelming. So we focus on, first and foremost, developing a benchmarking on the CRREM pathway, which is to say that our assets are going to, both from an intensity and emissions perspective, follow the Paris Agreement. So we establish where each asset sits relative to the CRREM pathway. We then set a very clear decarbonization plan, which lays out when we're going to invest capital and what the impact of that capital investment is from a corrective measure perspective in terms of reducing our emissions and intensity, and making sure we kind of fit within the CRREM pathway. So we start there for everything in our portfolio, and then we monitor, I think, the external market data. In particular, we're paying attention to supply. And I think you take, if you look at the London market, for instance, around offices, the retrofits need to increase by about 4x to follow the legislative requirement for 2030, but also it's well behind occupier demand. So for us, that starts, and this will feed into the leasing comment, but we're also monitoring valuations. So there hasn't been a lot of activity around the capital markets. However, from what we have observed, things like a top level BREEAM certification can drive upwards of 15 to 20% premium against a standard building. We know that if you make a step on the EPC ratings, each single step 3 to 4% increase on the valuation. And then on the rent side, monitoring the market data, take a look at like the West End, for instance. You can see upwards of a 50% spread, even higher, on something that's EPCA versus again standard. So that for us allows us to go back to that CREM pathway analysis and either ratchet up or down, depending on whether or not we can derive some form of return from it. In some instances, we'll do more of our corrective measures because we think that return justifies it. And in some instances, we'll do some, but not as much, kind of waiting for the market to come to us. So it's a bit of a continuous circle. And then I think ultimately the way that this needs to play out for investors is one, there's you have to do it from a liquidity standpoint, so that you've got to have something in the works, or else you run the risk of obsolescence. But I think on the other side too, we need to see occupiers pay more rent for the right product in the right location. And I think that's, in some places that's happening sooner or faster than others. I think across our European portfolio, for instance, Paris and London, were able to justify some of that investment sooner. Whereas Berlin, which is right now just got a weak leasing market for a number of reasons, that becomes a bit more difficult. However, in some instances too, you can take an entrepreneurial view and say, you make that decision today. If you're in a weaker market, no one's doing it, and 2 years from now, when you complete, you'll be the only one, and you've really got an opportunity to dictate price then, if you really believe in sort of the demand side. So it's complicated, I guess, but it's also we try and ground ourselves in some of the foundational sort of data points in making these decisions and evaluating sort of the portfolio.
Thanks, Jay. We're getting quite a few questions through the Q&A at the moment, so thanks for those. Keep them coming through. I think I'll draw a couple of them together that are around the question of metrics and analysis. So Katie Withers asks, isn't Brown discount just merging with the age of property? So like when you're leasing an office, the older, less efficient building is cheaper than the new building next door. I think that is true, and it goes to the point I was trying to make earlier that there's a lot tied up in the price of a building, not just the green credentials of it. And often there's a high correlation that a brand new building is going to be a very green one, but it's also really high quality and tends to be a good location. And it's hard to tease out how much of the price is driven by all those different factors. So MSCI, we've been developing, we've got data on two sides. We've got transactional data through our real capital analytics database, and we have hedonic pricing models that have age and submarket and the size of the building in there. So some things like that are controlled for. So we are kind of separating age from the green rating of the building. But there are more dimensions to performance than just those three things. So there's more work we can do to try and tease out those effects. And then on the valuation side of things, we've been doing some work on factor analysis, where we throw in all sorts of different characteristics around the quality of the building and the yield and the leasing profile of the building, as well as these green metrics. But there's no perfect green metric. So this links with another question that Emma Fletcher sent in. Is it time for a Gillette report for buildings? So what's the best a building can be in terms of its potential energy performance or carbon intensity? And so that hits to a point that we see in the valuation data a lot, is we can get actual emissions from our clients on lots of buildings, but that contrasts with like an EPC style rating, which is more about the potential of the building rather than the actual operational carbon emissions. Lots of our clients are focused on those operational carbon emissions because it needs to be reported in their kind of carbon footprinting. But you can imagine a very different intensity of use between, say, a City of London office building that's occupied by a high octane hedge fund, where everyone's got like 8 monitors and there's a huge amount of activity from 6 till 10 at night, versus a sort of suburban office local authority that's occupied 9 to 5 in a less intense way. So And then also you bring into vacancy rates, and there's lots of complications driving actual emissions. So I think there is some value in these kind of like potential efficiency ratings of buildings that are independent of actually how they're being used today. But it's horses for courses in terms of what you're trying to do with that data, and is it for kind of actual carbon emissions reporting, or is it trying to work out potentials and the kind of pricing of the potential of a building? So maybe we can use that as a segue to come back.
Sorry, I was just going to come in on one particular point there, because you touched again on the point of data, and I think this also ties into things like regulation and accreditation. Is quite often too many of these things we're looking at it through a static position, right? So you're looking at a point in time position. So we talk about green buildings, and you're talking about BREEAM and the standard that the building gets delivered to. That's not always converting into or continuing through a measure, and I'm only picking on one standard, which is BREEAM, but you've got BREEAM in use. You can design a building to a standard, and it starts at that point, but how is it then actually going to be utilized by the occupier? And I think we need that position to continue to evolve, and I think probably the same applies. Lucy touched on it a little bit around the domestic residential market as well, and what are the incentives for the improvements that are ongoing.
Yeah,
thanks, Evan. Yeah, Lucy, do you want to come?
Can I pick up there? Yeah, I think it's really interesting thinking about that in the residential market as well, and actually how we measure things and how people understand them as well, because for the residential market, you're kind of then that basically is everyone, like the consumers in the world, like what do they understand by it? And actually that's where it's quite interesting, the zero bills thing, because actually people understand that they know what that means for them, but on the other measures they don't know what it necessarily means. And energy efficiency, they might want to be in that direction, but actually they don't really know what it means or the impact. And actually by electrifying housing, heating and hot water, actually yes, you use less energy overall because of the efficiency of heat pumps if it's all working properly, but actually the cost of that energy is greater because gas is subsidized and much cheaper than electricity. So it doesn't necessarily, by making a heat pump more insulated home, mean that your versus your gas run home, actually the cost to you as a running that home might not actually be any different. It might even increase it. So actually, there are people that have put in heat pumps into their existing housing, spent loads of money to do it, and actually their costs are higher because the electricity costs are higher. So I think there is something around how does the country work in terms of how the government subsidizes gas versus electricity, and how do people understand that? Which is a massive challenge. And then how do we measure these things like EPC ratings? I think people are more familiar with them, but what does that really mean? And I completely agree, like how do we use that measure as going forward, and what do people understand by it? Because it's the potential of the building rather than actually how you're using it. And just changing some light bulbs, okay, that helps to some extent, but does that necessarily help massively? And actually, if we were to actually measure how much energy a home is using and use that as a guide, then that would probably be more helpful, because you'd actually be able to directly compare and also see the difference between just the basic running of a home, which is what your EPC kind of covers as well, versus actually if you're in your home all the time, if lots of people are working there or gaming or cooking all day, then that's going to be a huge need much more energy than if you literally just are out all day, come home, sleep, and then you leave to go to work again in the morning or whatever it is. So I think homes are used very differently, and therefore the use they have is very different as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand the intensity of use of a building when you're comparing the carbon intensity of the building. There's lots of apples to pears comparisons there. Franz, I know in the kind of prep course for this, you were interested in metrics and how a purely metrics driven approach to this problem could backfire. Have you got any comments on that you'd like to add?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we definitely need a metrics-driven approach to make apples-to-apples comparisons. I think that came out in the discussion now in the questions that we got from the audience. The question about age and how it's related to energy efficiency. And I think all those things can really just be addressed by metrics-driven approaches. So the old adage of what gets measured gets managed, I think that all still holds. But I think we also need to take a step back and ask the question, what are the right metrics and what is kind of a comprehensive 360-degree view of them? Because if we don't capture everything, then there is a real danger, inherent danger in people trying to game the system or just optimize towards one particular metric. And as much criticism there is against EPCs and that they are an imperfect measure, we still find ourselves talking about EPCs all the time. So if they were so bad, why are we still using them? I think there is some value to them. But I think, yeah, metrics-driven approaches, as necessary as they are, I think, and as dry and boring as the debate about metrics and the nitty-gritty of them is, I think they need to be taken seriously, especially with the pushback that I mentioned earlier in my statement, the allegations of greenwashing, and not just allegations, there are actually examples of that, are evidence of that metrics-driven approaches are sometimes used, are sometimes gamed in a way. And the better designed they are and the more holistic they are, I think the less of a chance there is for greenwashing and that backfiring of metrics-based approaches.
Yeah, I think there's a real element of whether it's green rating, building ratings like BREEAM, or whether it's EPCs or actual emissions data, there are different levels of standardization, different levels of coverage. So like BREEAM ratings, like it's very voluntary. So you tend to find that people that are going to get a good rating are going to pay for those certificates. Whereas EPCs are kind of mandated. They're a bit more kind of broader coverage and maybe a bit less biased from that perspective, even accounting for the kind of limitations of the EPC certificates themselves. When we look at their data, because we got transactional data as well as valuation data, so far at least, we've found kind of a premium when you're measuring the greenness based on those kind of green building ratings, because they tend to be quite visible to investors, and when you're underwriting, it's clear that these buildings have got kind of ratings, whereas actual emissions data is known to some owners of buildings, but by not the vast majority. But they're certainly not known as a standard by people looking to buy those buildings. It's much harder to get hold of that information. And so when we look at actual emissions data and trying to find some pricing valuation impact in the valuation data, we don't see as much of a pattern there. And I think that's partly to do with how visible it is, but also whether or not valuers are explicitly valuing the kind of brown or green credentials of building when they're coming up with those valuations. I see, David, you got your hand up there. Maybe you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, sort of touched on it earlier around, I think we probably all agree that EPC isn't necessarily the best standard that we should be drawn to, but I think we're drawn to it because of regulation and because it actually has the regulatory teeth. And I think one of the things that personally I continue to grapple with is, if we really want to make change, this has to be still a little bit more stick than carrot, I think. And I'm not so sure how long the consultation paper has been out now on MEES and whether you're actually going to shift it to, C by 2028, B by 2030. But I think some of the pace around some of the changing of the regulation is also potentially, holding back the market, because, what is genuinely the incentive to make those changes, but I think the link to the EPCs and then how that feeds through into a brown discount is becoming far more evident in the transactional market at the moment.
Thanks, David. We just got one question actually linked to banking, asking, is there any legislation coming in for banks with loans against brown assets in terms of ensuring provisions are set aside to upgrade assets and make them kind of compliant with climate change issues? you're aware of thing along those lines?
Not specifically that I'm aware of. I guess, we've set our own targets. So HSBC has said that we want to be, net zero or financed emissions from the clients that we lend to across the whole of our book by 2050. And to do that, you've obviously got to start to have a start point and work out where you're going to, but no specific regulations at the moment, as far as I'm aware.
And David, are you guys doing anything with that aspiration to motivate or incentivize some of your borrowers? Like, do you, if certain milestones are reached, get a reduction in margin or something like that?
Yes, yeah. So we do when we look at transactions that qualify as green transactions. So either green loans or sustainability linked loans. We actually look at them and look at different return levels that we're aspiring to get, and that is through us trying to stimulate the market and trying to encourage people to do that. So if you can, you sort of almost incentivize the action that they're taking to get into that position.
Yeah, because if you combine that with more rent, and you combine that with a little bit of yield compression, you start to get to justification for acceleration, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Jay, maybe I can come to you. I mean, we talked maybe a little bit more negatively around kind of the challenges around this. Do you see opportunities across the UK and Europe related to this? Like any strategies that you're thinking about to capitalize on this, that kind of bifurcation in the market?
Yeah, I mean, we drummed up a brown to green strategy probably 12 months ago. I would say the evolution of that is now it's a piece of the puzzle. It's not an isolated strategy. So you're still looking for the best located building. One market might present a little bit more opportunity than another at any given point in time. So we now use that sort of brown to green strategy in combination with a couple of other variables. But yeah, I think there's definitely going to be opportunity in this space. Where that opportunity sits, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think where we spend our time in order to prepare ourselves for that is becoming both technically and commercially very versed and well-versed around this particular topic. Where are, for instance, on the technical side, really studying how much capital needs to go into what vintage of building to understand that if we're buying something from 2005 versus 1995, is there a distinct difference in the amount of capex that's going to need to go in from a retrofit perspective, so that we can narrow our focus. And then on the commercial side, it's are we focusing on EPCA? Are we focusing on CREM pathway? How are we marketing our product to the occupier? We haven't spent a lot of time talking about the end user and what's important to them, but we are constantly spending time with the end user, trying to understand where they're changing. And Gen Z is the next office occupant, so what's important to Gen Z. So I think we become stewards of and we study that side of things in our active portfolio to a high degree to take advantage of what is pending and what is potentially coming, which we feel is just a matter of time.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about that kind of strategy that you formed 12 months ago has kind of just become like a broader kind of way of doing things. I remember in the previous role, we came up with the idea of a kind of improver portfolio. And the response from a lot of asset owners was, well, if this makes sense as a standalone strategy, why don't you just roll this out across the whole portfolio and it's just a way of doing things, because it's the right thing to do, and there's kind of fiduciary kind of there's a return there as well. But I was wondering whether you see, maybe not from yourselves, but what you see in the market from other kind of asset managers, with a lot of kind of dry capital waiting on the wings, the kind of depressed market values, whether you see some of the kind of distressed, what normally would be kind of distressed opportunity funds kind of really focusing on this kind of brown to green strategy. Are you seeing many of them like really marketing themselves to guys like you with those kind of explicit strategies? And are there certain property types or sort of managers that you'd expect to do particularly well in that kind of strategy? Why shouldn't everybody be doing this kind of thing as just part of what they do, versus there being kind of these very specific strategies on brown to green? Is it just a marketing thing, or is there certain things that certain managers or certain strategies can do that others can't?
Yeah, I mean, it's a competency topic.
Yeah.
I think some groups just have invested in this. They've built it into their structure, and others haven't.
Mm-hmm.
Some markets are more advanced. I mean, we constantly look to the Scandinavian countries. I mean, I was just in Copenhagen for 3 days, because they've been talking about this in that market for much longer, and that's a great place to for us to learn from, and there's some great managers and developers in that space there. We tend to we are a manager and a developer, so we don't necessarily tend to partner with someone on that basis, but we certainly watch some of them, and from a best-in-class standpoint, there's groups like Edge is a group we watch quite closely. NREP is another one. There's a group in the residential space that's quite strong. Heimstatten, they're quite large as well. So I think we're always looking at industry benchmarks and best in class, and studying that too.
Great, thanks, Jay. And we're coming towards the end of the webinar now, but maybe one more question that draws together a couple of comments from the Q&A was going back to the residential sector as well. There's a few comments around, because some of the kind of the highly prized assets in residential tend to be the older ones. There's some comments around kind of exempting older properties from EPCs and these kind of needs for decarbonisation, almost like classic cars from road tax. What are your thoughts on that, Lucy, and given the amount of old stock that's in residential real estate?
Yeah, I guess there are still exemptions. And I think it's a really difficult balance, isn't it? Like, how do we preserve our historic buildings and also make them energy efficient? And I think there are some really awesome programs where those that own historic buildings want to get them to higher standard, and working with conservation officers and being able to actually do some really good versions of doing it whilst to get the best of both. But it does cost a lot, and it takes a lot to do. I think if we can learn lessons from that and that can be applied elsewhere, then that would be brilliant. But there are a lot of listed properties in the country, and there's very limited restriction. There's a lot of restrictions and limitations on what you can do, even to the extent where, even in my home, which is a 1950s block of flats in London, we're not allowed to have double glazing, and you're just like, why on earth is that in place?
Yeah.
So there's some silly restrictions that you sort of think, actually, come on, you could have some sensible versions of this. But I think it takes a bigger picture than just thinking, oh well, this is my sector, I can only, or this, I'm just preserving the quality of this home rather than the look of it, rather than being sensible.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. I better draw it to a close here and hand back to Munish. Thanks all the panelists for a really insightful discussion, and I'll hand over to Munish to close us out. Oh, you're on mute, Munish.
Thanks so much, Will, for your excellent moderation. Of course, Franz, Lucy, David, and Jay, for your brilliant contributions, and of course to the attendees for your questions and your attendance today. This has hopefully whetted your appetite for further events that you can join us on. We've got a couple coming up that I just want to highlight. On 12th of June, we're in conversation with the UN's Climate Change High-Level Champion for COP28 and UNFCCC Ambassador Nigel Topping with UKGBC CEO Smith Mordak. So you can find more information about that on our website. And on 9th of July, we're doing a tour of the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership's award-winning ultra-sustainable retrofit of a commercial building in the heart of Cambridge. Thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in future events, and thank you once again for our panelists for your excellent insights. Have a great day, everyone.